But wherever this leads us next, it's clear to me now that I was too hasty to completely dismiss crypto on the basis of all the things wrong with it at the moment, instead of appreciating the fundamental freedom to transact that it's currently our best shot at protecting. You don't need laser eyes or an NFT avatar to appreciate that. Hello and welcome to Ethereum Audible. I'm your host, Zlatiborski, and this is where we read the best in the Ethereum and Web3 ecosystem. It's been 2 weeks of a break from this podcast, and I am back and energized, and I'm glad to have you here with me. I'd say the crypto world has been in a little bit of not a funk, but we think we're in a funk. We think we're in a bear market, but really, if you just kind of zoom out over the past year, 2 years, Bitcoin's at 40K, Ethereum's at 25K, not 25K, $2,500. And that's really not a bear market in any way, shape, or form. People are still building really cool things in DeFi games. Proof of stake is getting closer for Ethereum. Modular blockchain is approaching. So really there's a lot to be excited about, and the promise of crypto is still alive and probably more needed today than ever before. And I want to take a break from proof of stake in the merge, roll-up centric Ethereum, which is what we've been talking about for the past few episodes, and take a segue into why Web3, why crypto is so important, why we really need to be focusing on this, and why I care. And to start that off, I'm going to be reading a short but really, I think, important piece that David Heinemeier Hansen, DHH, wrote just 2 weeks ago. DHH is one of the founders of Basecamp. He is very, very vocal on social media. He's been anti-crypto before, but this piece called I Was Wrong, We Need Crypto really dives into why we need crypto. And there's a lot going on in the news over the past week and a half about Russia and Ukraine. This is shifting to a different news item from prior weeks, which is the Canadian protest, the trucker protest that was happening in Canada kind of in the last 2 weeks of February around vaccine mandates that the Canadian government had instituted for truckers. And just for some context before we dive into the article, the Canadian government instituted these mandates for truckers where if you don't have a vaccine, you have to isolate for 14 days once you cross the border, once you re-enter Canada. These are truckers who cross into the United States every single day, and mandating the 14-day isolation was basically untenable for them. And so they decided to protest. The only other alternative was to vaccinate. And as people who believed in freedom of choice, they did not think that this was a lawful use of government power. And so they started to protest, blocking roads, using their trucks to block bridges, park them in the middle of cities. And really, it turned into a pro-vaccine, anti-vaccine kind of protest. And around that, the Canadian government decided to freeze the protesters' bank accounts, access to financial aid. People who were donating were put on a censure list. And basically, all of this they decided to do without due process, and the government seized emergency power, something that they had only done in World War I and World War II, and for this very dangerous trucker protest. And this is kind of the background to DHH's piece, I Was Wrong, We Need Crypto. So we are going to dive into that, give it a read. But before we do that, I just want to thank the sponsors that make Ethereum Audible possible, and that is Alpe Audio, ALPE Audio, which is an audio education platform, basically where Coursera meets podcasts. If you could imagine podcasts that are educational and pedagogical, where you can listen to a course on your way to work, that is Alpe Audio. Every lesson and course comes with summaries, flashcards, notes, chapters, additional resources so that you can dive into it later. Basically everything you need so that you can learn on the go from A to Z in depth. And thank you very much, Alpe Audio, for your help with Ethereum Audible. And with that, let's go. David Heinemeier Hansen. I was wrong. We need crypto, from February 21st, 2022. To say I've been skeptical about Bitcoin and the rest of the crypto universe would be an understatement of epic proportions. Since the early 2010s, some of my most ferocious Twitter battles have been against the HODL army with the laser eyes. There's just so much to oppose. Bitcoin's grotesque energy consumption, the ridiculous transaction fees and low throughput, the incessant pump and dump schemes in shitcoins, the wild price swings in the main coins, the obvious fraud that is Tether, the lack of real decentralization in most of the current Web3 infrastructure, and on and on and on. Beyond all these very real problems and challenges, my bigger beef was actually fueled by a lack of imagination. I could see the fundamental promise of a digital currency free of banks if you were living in a failing state like Venezuela, or an overtly authoritarian one like China or Iran. But how is this relevant to the vast number of Bitcoin boosters living in stable Western democracies governed by the rule of law? Beyond the patina of philosophical respectability, it could apply to yet another get-rich-quick scheme. Now, what's that saying again? Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they aren't after you? It's starting to smell like that. Just because Bitcoin's most virtuous argument was presented, in if not bad faith, then in figly faith, by get-quick-rich boosters, doesn't mean it isn't true. Enter the trucker protests in Canada. In just 3 weeks of honking, blocked streets, and bridges, bouncy castles, and flag-waving, this peaceful protest movement managed to provoke the most shockingly authoritarian response from the Canadian government. First, the Ottawa Police Department got GoFundMe to confiscate donations with the intention of redirecting them to other causes. Then, after an outcry, they backed down to merely blocking the money for 7 to 10 days before refunding. That seemed like a draconian escalation, completely at odds with the tens of millions of dollars raised for social justice causes during the protest summer of 2020. But at the time, I thought it was something another fundraising platform, one less likely to collaborate with Canadian authorities, could route around. And GiveSendGo indeed started doing just that. Turns out the concern over the donations was quickly rendered insignificant, as just a few days later, the Canadian Prime Minister imposed martial law on the protesters. Through powers intended for catastrophic events, he took to freeze the bank accounts of both Canadian protesters and donors, to compulsorily demand that tow truck operators clear the streets, and forced insurance companies to drop policies for the protesters. That quote-unquote worked. Together with police storming the protests with pepper spray and stun grenades, the area in front of Parliament was cleared. But even that wasn't enough. Even with the protests cleared out, the police vowed to press their new financial powers against anyone involved for months to come. So Canadians who donated to the truckers should now sleep with one eye open for the next several months, lest they have their bank accounts frozen and indictments filed on the basis of laws enacted to prevent financing of terrorism? Or maybe their bank will simply preemptively cancel their accounts if they appeared on the hacked list of donators from GiveSendGo. This is crazy, absolutely bonkers, terrifying. I still can't believe that this is the protest that would prove every Bitcoin crank a profit, and for me to have to slice a piece of humble pie and admit that I was wrong on crypto's fundamental necessity in Western democracies, and that it was the Canadians who brought this on. You might as well have told me that it was really the Care Bears who ran Abu Ghraib. Especially since I had some sympathy with fears projected by the US progressive left, who spent 4 years fretting Trump might pull stunts like these. Then it turns out that the worries of an authoritarian overreach would be fulfilled by Trudeau to the north instead. Who's writing the script? M. Night Shyamalan? Meanwhile, plenty of American commentators are cheering this on. Those terrible, horrible, no good, very bad truckers got what they deserved. To protest for a repeal of pandemic restrictions so as to live the life enjoyed in Denmark by a population less vaccinated than the Canadians. That's clearly beyond the pale. But in a weird way, I'm glad we all got this warning from Trudeau in Canada and not Trump in America. It would have been far too easy for Europeans in particular to dismiss authoritarian assertions of martial law from Trump as being irrelevant to the European existence, just like I had for so long deemed the practical desire of people in Venezuela or Iran or China for crypto irrelevant to the Western experience. Is France really that different from Canada? Is Austria? Is Denmark? This is a real wake-up call. It reminds me of the Snowden revelations. Prior to him bringing proof, the idea that America was processing all of the emails in the world, recording any phone call anywhere it will, and monitoring all internet traffic just seemed so hyperbolic. I remember discussing this with a friend in the 2000s when the rumor of Echelon had gained some traction. It just didn't seem believable until it was undeniable. I'm sitting with that same feeling here. Even just a few months ago, I would not have found it credible if you said a 3-week peaceful protest in Canada could have led to martial law, frozen bank accounts, and terrorist financing laws being used to hunt protest donors. Unbelievable then, undeniable now. I don't think we have any idea what kind of radicalizing seeds have been planted by Trudeau with these actions. This is one of those world events that you can imagine a documentary of the future opening with, "It all started when." But wherever this leads us next, it's clear to me now that I was too hasty to completely dismiss crypto on the basis of all the things wrong with it at the moment, instead of appreciating the fundamental freedom to transact that it's currently our best shot at protecting. You don't need laser eyes or an NFT avatar to appreciate that. Great. So as I said, this is a relatively short piece, but it is so important. So important, and I think it brings home why crypto is so important. And it really is the freedom to transact. There's this great tweet thread by Punk6529 who goes into why the freedom to transact, the freedom not to be censored, is the underlying principle of all the other civil liberties that we have. And I'm going to just run and read through that as well. There are no other constitutional rights in substance without freedom to transact. Meaning to write this for 6 months, but the Canadian response to the trucker protest is illustrating this so vividly that today is the day. I assume we are in agreement that constitutional democracies are a good form of government, or at least a better form of government than the other methods we have found to date. This means that I am taking for granted the following assumptions: that people have fundamental rights to speech, assembly, and religion, that people are innocent until proven guilty, and that the state cannot punish people without due process, which generally means that in a court of law, the state has to prove you have broken some specific law. If you disagree with the principles of above, I guess that's fine but weird, but probably you can safely exit this thread now because it's unlikely that we're going to agree on anything else. People who know me in real life know that I have been harassing them for years that without the freedom to transact, you have no other constitutional rights. And mostly they look at me strangely, and I look at them strangely because it seems obvious to me. Freedom of speech might require such activities like a website, a pamphlet, an advertisement, paying a graphic designer, traveling to a different location, all of which cost money. Freedom of assembly might require such activities like taking a train to Washington, D.C., booking a hotel room, hiring a taxi, buying a hot dog, all of which cost money. Freedom of religion might require such activities like renting a space for a facility, paying the salaries of religious officials, and buying food and consumables, all of which cost money. I can go on, but I think the point is clear. The exercise of rights costs money. Historically, the risk of financial censorship has been much lower because for the literally whole of human history, until approximately 2001, it was mostly uncontroversial that people could have decentralized, non-custodial mediums of exchange. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans used commodity money, from cowrie shells to gold. And then in the last few hundred years, we have had various forms of cash-based instruments as well. All of these are non-custodial, decentralized, and have no KYC. Over the past 20 years, the institutional environment has shifted to a posture that non-custodial money is default suspicious. Central banks who want the death of cash, the Patriot Act and derivatives thereof, and geopolitical pressures via the banking system. But hey, isn't the point to prevent money laundering and stopping terrorism and reduce tax evasion? Yeah, I agree that these are the stated goals and that an actual subset of the actual goals. I'm also against money laundering, terrorism, and tax evasion. The problem, however, is that there is both short-term and long-term goal creep. In the US and EU, banks and payment processors have been pressured to cut off accounts to gun shops, adult businesses, crypto businesses, and other perfectly legal businesses. I consider this to be undemocratic. If a country would like to make pornography or guns or cryptocurrency illegal, it has every right to pass laws to do so. And then the citizens can re-elect or de-elect the politicians who voted for it and or challenge it in court. What happens instead is hidden deep bureaucracy type bullshit, where the banks point to their regulators and say, well, they told us to close high-risk accounts. And the regulators point to the banks and say, we never said that, just, be careful. And the net effect is that you don't have a bank account anymore, and there's no recourse, no due process, not even an actual law that says you should not have an account. It's a deep bureaucracy running a parallel, opaque, unwritten legal system, deeply undemocratic. Even in the current system, being unbanked and having to rely on cash is more or less ejecting you from the modern economy. Paying bills, getting a paycheck, paying vendors, investing in a 401k, buying crypto even, all require access to traditional payment rails. But guess what? It's getting worse. Many central banks have stated goals for their CBDCs, those central bank digital currencies, to eliminate cash, allow global transaction censorship, apply deeply negative interest rates. A system of this kind would be the most powerful system of centralized control the world has ever known. Even Stalin, Hitler, or Mao did not have the ability to apply global transaction censorship across their empires at the touch of a button. What will happen is some aspiring dictator will censor their opponent's spending during an election period, and they won't be able to buy a tomato, let alone run a campaign. With such power and no due process, it's a certainty. Power-hungry people tend to run for office. Notice that the third goal is mission creep. Nobody started this process in 2001 saying, the goal is to be able to apply negative interest rates to your savings. And yet, here we are. Below a certain negative rate, people will withdraw their money, so let's prevent them. The way this process has been working is that we are the frog and we are being boiled slowly. Every year, the reporting requirements get a little broader, the penalties steeper, the restrictions on cash withdrawals more severe. And most of all, the presumption of innocence is turning into a presumption of guilt. Why do you want to withdraw $5,000 in cash? If you have nothing to hide, why do you need non-custodial instruments? Non-custodial is dangerous. I remind you that literally for the whole of human history, non-custodial was the main form of the mediums of exchange. It is a very recent concept that this is a bad thing. It's effectively a quiet power grab by the state. This is why one of the reasons that crypto has been generally disliked by central banks in particular. Here they are, closing in on the end of cash, and now a new form of digital cash emerges. And in their view, they need to reel that in too for the rest to work. So, back to our constitutional rights. You have constitutional rights, but you need money to exercise them. The state acquires the power to cut off funding. What might happen next? Well, I know what happens. All of my friends think I'm just overreacting, at which point I present to you the liberal prime minister of a G7 country known for its extreme good nature and general easygoingness, Trudeau. Prime Minister Trudeau has a political problem. The specific political problem is some truck drivers have blocked parts of Canadian cities and highways to protest his COVID-19 policies. This is annoying him, annoying his voters, and probably bad for the economy. I don't actually have a view on the substance of the truckers' protest and if Canada's COVID policies are good, bad, or neutral. I would further guess that the truckers are probably violating a variety of Canadian laws relating to how they can protest. What would be a normal constitutional democracy political response to a problem like this is either let it play out if you think it's in good faith, or encourage the local authorities to arrest them and try them in a court if you think it's not. Either is fine. The right to assembly in Canada probably does not allow you to block the highways for days for everyone else. I assume Canada still has police and courts, so they could presumably arrest the highway blockers and take them to court. When you go to court in a democracy, the following typically applies. You are innocent until proven guilty. The state has to be specific about which law you have violated, and the state has to prove it, usually beyond a reasonable doubt. I understand that at times this is annoying for the state. You have to collect evidence, the defendants will get their own lawyers, there is time and expense involved, and sometimes you might not win. This is the price of a free country. But this is not what is happening today in Canada. The state has invoked its Emergencies Act, which is defined below. It seems a bit ambitious to imagine that the protests exceeded the capacity of a province to deal with, or threatened the sovereignty of Canada. But, and here is the definition of what constitutes a national emergency, quote, "The Act defines a national emergency as an urgent and critical situation of temporary nature that seriously endangers the lives, health, or safety of Canadians and is of such proportions or nature as to exceed the capacity or authority of a province to deal with it, or seriously threatens the ability of the Government of Canada to preserve the sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity of Canada." I am even willing to stretch and say, okay, maybe it was correct to invoke the Act, and let's see what he plans to do with it. What was done with the Act made my jaw drop, however. It is my, oh, this might happen in the future scenario. But today, Canada has asked every single financial system provider, from banks to credit card companies to investment firms to crowdfunding platforms to crypto companies to insurance companies, to freeze the accounts of anyone directly or indirectly supporting the protests. Given the powers of the Emergency Act, there is no due process on these actions and no civil liability for this freezing. In the short term, the goal is to shut down the protests by nuking the protesters' financial infrastructure. I have to say this is not the model of criminal justice I expected to see in a constitutional democracy. You can't just go around freezing people's savings instead of, arresting them and charging them with a crime. Even worse, the indirect supporters. The indirect supporters have been very fuzzily defined in the press releases. It might include the crowdfunders, but it might include a family member who sends money to someone protesting in order to buy them a meal. They are being treated as terrorist financiers. But hey, these guys are terrorists. They're trying to overthrow the government. I don't know. I'm not sure about this. I don't live in Canada. But Canada has a pretty advanced security infrastructure. I do not think it is at any real risk of being taken over. What is a real risk is that constitutional rights will be curtailed not through laws or court cases, but through weaponization of the financial system. Today, you're on Trudeau's side and dislike the truckers, but it's not always this way. Would you feel the same if Donald Trump was freezing all the financial infrastructure of Black Lives Matters and all of their indirect supporters? It's a terrible precedent to set. In politics, you must always, always, always invert. The way to judge an idea is not if your team in power should do it. The way to judge the idea is if you think your worst political enemy should have this power and if you feel comfortable that the team you hate won't abuse it. It is a mistake to roll out the whole anti-terrorism infrastructure for political protesters and their indirect supporters. The next time around, the other team will use it against you. And this begets a cycle of political violence that ends badly. I have just been discussing the immediate term effects. The long-term effects will be worse. I suspect without explicit action, many of the people unbanked now will not be rebanked because financial institutions won't want the headache of doing so. So this is not just a short-term thing, but an uncertain duration ejection from the financial system. No banking, no credit cards, no investments, no insurance, which for truckers means no job. This type of punishment requires due process. This can get so much worse though. If we end up with a fully custodial system, which means no cash and no non-custodial crypto, full control of digital currency, then these types of actions can happen at the push of a button, instantly across large groups of people. Oh, but we would never abuse this power. Right, of course not. And yet here we are with Canada, close to my least likely test case for weaponization of the financial system against domestic dissent. Every day, every month, every year, I'm here to say the same thing. The internet, computers, big data, machine learning allow us to centralize information flows in a way that we could never had before. It's exciting, but it's also dangerous. It is critically important that we don't sleepwalk into an economic, digital, and metaverse architecture that is completely centralized. Whether it's on the corporate or state systems, it will eventually end up under state control because states control the exercise of power. And so the too long don't read of this entire thread is that 1, financial systems underpin everything, including our constitutional rights. 2, weaponizing the financial system to resolve domestic dissent or even criminal justice issues is a terrible precedent to set. And 3, we must preserve non-custodial wallets at all costs. Now, that's a massive tweet thread by Punk6529. I will link to it in the podcast notes. And here you had 2 for the price of 1, 2 read-throughs on this important topic. But he does a great job of really bringing it home that the freedom to transact underlies all the other freedoms we have. And today we live in a more centralized world, especially in the Western world where we wouldn't think so, than ever before. Where we used to be able to use cash, today most people don't. Without a credit card, there are lots of places where you can't even buy something anymore. A lot of public transit has moved to electronic payments. A lot of local grocery shops or Uber or, all kinds of things just don't accept cash. It's not worth it because everyone's gone over to credit cards, and your credit card is tied to your bank account or tied to your credit rating. And the second the government decides that you are no longer viable, you will be shut down. And that holds true for other things like your personal insurance or homeowners insurance, medical bills. The financial system encompasses everything today, and it's more centralized than ever before. And if this can happen in a Western democracy, just imagine where we're going. And it doesn't look good. And this is why we need crypto systems. This is why we need decentralized and non-custodial wallets at all costs, so that we always maintain the freedom to transact and a freedom that's non-censorable. And if we had any doubt about the importance of that, then today the Russian-Ukraine war, I think, brings that home much more. Because for me, my family has a background in the Holocaust and World War II, and so the reality of having to be refugees and run from war is still alive and kicking. The ability to just pick up and go and have those assets come with you is something that, even living in the Western world, still rings true for me because of our family history. And I think that the Russian-Ukraine war is bringing that home for a new generation, where you can just pick up and leave and become a refugee, but still have your assets with you because it's yours. It's non-custodial. It didn't get frozen in Russia. It didn't get frozen in Ukraine. And it's just a seed phrase that you can travel with and get access to wherever there's internet. And that is personal freedom. That's why we need crypto. That's why I think these articles are so important, especially among the hype of, shitcoins and NFTs and all kinds of things like that. But that is critical, and it's critical infrastructure that's being built. And at the core lies decentralization, because without decentralizations, the system will seize power of this. And that's why decentralization is such a focus of the different crypto blockchains that I get involved with, the projects that I care about, and also what leads us to the next article we'll be reading, which is more about the problems of Web3 and the current state of some of the centralization that we see in the Ethereum ecosystem specifically.